a little different than my normal topics here, but we're talking about the FIBA World Cup, which, for those of you who are unsure of, is the basketball World Cup, basically. It's just FIFA, but for basketball. And that is starting today when this video goes live. I'm recording this, of course, yesterday because I want to kind of clue you in a little bit to the community tab and show a survey poll I had done a couple of days ago, and just kind of gauging everyone's opinions on who they thought would win or who they're rooting for. And the U.S. kind of came out with 4 votes, the Germans with 3, and the Australians for 1. So actually kind of varied. I was really surprised to see that, and I'm glad, because we'll talk about all 3 of those teams to an extent throughout this video. Now, just like the FIFA World Cup, the FIBA World Cup is broken down into groups. So Group A is Angola, the Dominican Republic, the Philippines, and Italy. Italy's probably going to be one of the ones that gets out of that one pretty easily. Group B, South Sudan, Serbia, China, and Puerto Rico. Serbia's probably going to do pretty well, and then China's probably going to kind of go right there along with them. Each of these groups will have 2 advance into the knockout stage, if I'm remembering that correctly. Group C is the USA, Jordan, Greece, and New Zealand. It's probably going to be the US and Greece. Group D, Egypt, Mexico, Montenegro, and Lithuania. Group E, Germany, Finland, Australia, and Japan. That's probably one of the more competitive ones, seeing as realistically Germany and Australia are probably going to be the ones that come out of this, but Finland's fairly good and can compete with both of those teams, and Japan, to an extent, can do the same if certain things line up for them. Then you have Group F with Slovenia, Cape Verde, Georgia, and Venezuela. Slovenia is probably going to be the one that jumps out there pretty notably. And then you have Group G with Iran, Spain, Cote d'Ivoire, and Brazil. Spain and Brazil will probably advance. And kind of the next most competitive, you have Group H with Canada, Latvia, Lebanon, and France. Probably going to be Canada and France, but depending, the positioning on that could be very different. It could be France, Canada, Canada, France. They're both very good teams. They both are very competitive. So one of the teams, of course, that I'm going to be looking at and watching for is Team USA. I'm in America, and a lot of these players coming from the NBA, I'm very familiar with them. So as far as the starting, kind of consistent starting 5, we've seen a couple of different rotations here, but Jalen Brunson of the New York Knicks is going to run your point. Anthony Edwards from the Minnesota Timberwolves is your shooting guard. Mikal Bridges of the Brooklyn Nets is your small forward. Brandon Ingram of the New Orleans Pelicans as your power forward, and then Jaren Jackson Jr., the Defensive Player of the Year last year, at your center. Not necessarily the size of your traditional centers, but he's big enough to play that, and he's physical enough to do that as well. Then coming off the bench, you have Paolo Banchero from the Magic, the Rookie of the Year last year, Tyrese Haliburton from the Indiana Pacers, Josh Hart from the New York Knicks, Cam Johnson from the Brooklyn Nets, Walker Kessler from the Utah Jazz, Bobby Portis from the Milwaukee Bucks, and then Austin Reaves from the Los Angeles Lakers. In terms of players I'm keeping an eye out for, probably the biggest one that everyone's going to keep an eye out for is Anthony Edwards. You've had the coaching staff come out and say he's the guy for this team. He is the man who's leading the team. Maybe not strategically, but on the floor, he's taking charge in a lot of ways. So this could be kind of signs of a big step for him next year in the NBA. But he's already been a very good player, as we see there. Last season, 24.6 points a game, 5.8 rebounds for 5.4 assists. He's a really good player. But this kind of maybe signifies maybe he could take over that team out there in the Timberwolves. Then Paolo Banchero, this is his sophomore year, so any signs that he is improved or at least being consistent is, I think, going to be a big deal, especially for the Magic coming into a relatively tough year in terms of their schedule. But 20 points a game, 6.9 rebounds, 3.7 assists. He is a beast of a player. Then you have Tyrese Haliburton, who, depending on who you ask, is probably one of the better just true point guards. He's a pass-first guy. He's not that he can't shoot, obviously, but, 10.4 assists is high up there, right? He's real good at that. He's great for playmaking. He's great for running the set offense. He's just all around is a point guard really up there. But 20.7 points a game, 3.7 rebounds, and 10.4 assists. I think him doing well on this team, regardless of his position, is whether it's the one or the two, could really cement him as being injectable to a lot of different systems. So, I'm not saying that he's going to leave Indiana. He just re-signed a big deal with them. But I think that gives them more versatility in terms of either drafting new people or doing trades to bring new people in. He's going to be a key factor of that offense, and they can kind of build around that. And then you have Austin Reaves of the Los Angeles Lakers, who didn't make as much of a big splash, but is probably one of the more divisive guys on this roster. Really coming in for the Lakers late in the season last year and making a big difference. But 13 points per game, 3 rebounds, 3.4 assists. Warm-up performance, they've won all of them. They beat Puerto Rico, they beat Slovenia, and, well, I will say Slovenia did not have Luka in that game because of some, not necessarily injuries, but injury concerns. They still beat them by 30 points, even if Luka was on the floor. There's a good chance that still would have been a very close game, but probably would have been a U.S. victory. Then U.S.-Spain, U.S.-Germany, or U.S.-Greece, and then U.S.-Germany. All very good games. The U.S.-Germany and the U.S.-Spain games were pretty close for a good minute there. So they're real fun to go back and watch if you can find them, or at least just watch the highlights. Then we have Team Canada, and this is probably one of the most stacked Team Canada teams we've seen in a good while. It's not nearly stacked as Australia, we'll see in a moment, but Kyle Alexander, Nickeil Alexander-Walker of the Timberwolves, RJ Barrett from the Knicks, Trey Bell-Haynes, Dylan Brooks from the Grizzlies, Lou Dort from the Thunder, Zach Edey, Melvin Ejim, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander from the Thunder, Kelly Olynyk from the Utah Jazz, Dwight Powell from the Dallas Mavericks, and then Phil and Thomas Scrubb. That's a pretty stacked team, especially considering people are having conversations around whether Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is the best player in FIBA at the moment, even with Luka in the game. So he's up there. He was elite for the Thunder last season. So him carrying forward with that and running a totally different team is a pretty big deal. Now, Jamal Murray from the current NBA champions, the Denver Nuggets, was supposed to be on this team, but didn't get to play due to injury concerns. So this is effectively the roster you're looking at. And some variation, of course, because it's fairly recent news that Jamal Murray wasn't going to be on this team. But as far as the big three, I think Shai is going to be a big one. People are kind of having a lot of high expectations around him particularly. And even if he doesn't meet that, if he can be consistent with what he did last year, he's still really high up there. 31.4 points a game, 4.8 rebounds, 5.5 assists. The dude is a beast. There's a reason he's in those conversations. Now, a lot of people are kind of wondering maybe if this is his ceiling, if he's, going to kind of bounce around and, a few percentage points better or worse over the next few years. But, if you're at that, you are doing better than the vast majority of the NBA. So this is a good chance for people to see him in a different system, to see him have the ability to lead that system and maintain at least the relative levels of performance he had last season. And that gives people kind of an idea of what he's going to look like next season. Now, FIBA is a very different set of rules and the court sizing and whatnot, and spacing is different. But generally speaking, there are some key indicators you can take away, and we'll see how that goes. I may do a follow-up video after each of these teams is eliminated or goes on to kind of break down that performance, but we'll see. Kelly Olynyk of the Utah Jazz, good big man, 12.5 points a game, 6.2 rebounds, 3.7 assists. He's not necessarily the elite of the elite out there, but he's good, and I think this is where we'll get to see him maybe not necessarily blossom or flourish because he's done well with the Jazz. But if he ever comes up for trade topics or anything like that, I think this is a performance you can look back on and be like, he can fit into this type of system, or he can do this with this type of a guy, right? So is it going to change anything for Kelly Olynyk short term? Probably not. But if the Jazz decide to trade him, or he just wants to, go somewhere else, this will be a good chance to say, hey, I can work with this type of guy or this type of guy. And then Dwight Powell, I think, is probably going to be more of like a developmental watch to see if he can progress from what he did last year. Because this is something I think the Mavs, they've been working on for a while. So if he can come out and really perform, I think the questions around the Mavs' big situation gets a little alleviated. He's not going to go out there and, be Jokic by any means, but, as long as they can kind of facilitate some of that size, I think that's a big deal. In terms of their warm-up performance, they've done pretty well, only losing one game there to the end with the Dominican Republic. But yeah, they've beat Germany twice, which is pretty cool. They beat New Zealand and Spain. Spain also another one that's going to be pretty high up there, along with France and Germany. So they've done pretty well, even with kind of most of those games having the expectation of eventually having a Jamal Murray. So it wasn't necessarily set that Shai was either going to be the starting point or running the offense. So, you have some adjustment there. But now that that's confirmed, we can go into the actual games and see how that performance goes. And I think it's going to go pretty well. We've seen quite a bit of good stuff out of Shai and the team so far. And last but most definitely not least, Team Australia. I do believe some of these guys have been cut or have got injury concerns, but we'll go through them anyway. So you have Xavier Cook from the Washington Wizards, Dyson Daniels from the New Orleans Pelicans, Matthew Delvadona from the Sacramento Kings, Dante Exum from the Mavs, Josh Giddey from the Thunder, Josh Green from the Mavs, Chris Goulding, Joe Ingles from the Bucks, Nick Kay, Jock Lundell from the Suns, Will McDowell-White, Patty Mills from the Brooklyn Nets, Diop Reith, Matisse Thybulle from the Trailblazers, and then Jack White from the Thunder. Mills and White, I don't believe have... White has not played for the Thunder, but he's on the roster. We'll see if he makes it through training camp. Patty Mills, I want to say was in a trade somewhere else, but I can't remember who else it was. So he may not be wearing a Nets jersey next year, but in terms of NBA talent outside of the U.S. team, this is probably the next most stacked. Now, there are probably a few names you've heard here, but most of these are not like your all-NBA first-team guys. Like, these are good guys or consistent guys, but they're not necessarily the top of the top of the top. Now, in terms of players I'm going to be looking at, Josh Giddey's probably first and foremost. As a Thunder fan, of course, Giddey's going to be up there, and of course I pick teams that have some connection to the Thunder. But Josh Giddey is, from the coaching staff of the Australian team, the guy. He's the guy that's going to run the offense, facilitate. And from the warm-up games, he's done pretty well. He's still really young. I think he just turned 21. So there's still some development there, some refinement. But coming into this, outside of maybe a little bit more focus on making kind of the good passes. Like, he's a phenomenal passer, but, you're working with a totally different group of guys and some efficiency in terms of shooting. If he can do those things, I think we go into next year seeing Josh Giddey being in that conversation of an all-NBA team very easily. But 16.6 points a game last season, 7.9 rebounds, and 6.2 assists. I find it very funny that Josh Giddey is usually labeled as a point guard. But dude's like 6'8", 6'9". He's a very large point. He's a big boy. And you can kind of see that in the rebound numbers. He doesn't turn and run. He goes for that ball. But yeah, him running things, it'll be really interesting to see how he can tie this team together and if they can make it all the way to medaling. Then you have Josh Green, who much like Dwight Powell, is a little bit more of a developmental thing. Josh Green had some good moments, if I remember correctly, in the NBA Summer League. He's still fairly young as well. So this is someone that, if he has a really good performance, can kind of give the Mavs a little hope in terms of longer-term benchability, or even kind of trade aspects in the future. But 9.1 points a game, 3 rebounds, and 1.7 assists last season, so not bad. Then you have Matisse Thybulle from the Trailblazers. And the Trailblazers are, of course, a big question with the Dame Lillard trade and everything, but 4.1 points a game, 2 rebounds, 0.7 assists. He is also a really solid defender. So we've seen him do some pretty good things in the warm-up matches, and if he can continue to do that, I think you're going to see this Team Australia do very well. And that's really more of just in case Portland decides to kind of blow things up, he has the option to go somewhere else and have something to hang his hat on to be like, hey, I did this in the FIBA World Cup. This is the performance I'm giving. And of course, that's not going to sell people, but that's a nice little addition. So, if that does happen, he's got something to fall back on a little bit. And then Jack White, who is probably the most confusing person on this list for most people. 1.2 points a game, 1 rebound, and 0.2 assists. Jack White is really less of a player to watch for the general public and more just for either teams that may be looking to pick someone up for depth in after training camp, or for Thunder fans, because he is on the roster, but if you're a Thunder fan, the roster is going to need to be cut at least, I think, by 3 more positions by the time the season starts, and Jack White's name comes up a lot. So if he and Giddey can work really well, he at least comes into training camp with that, but also the confidence of knowing he can do that. Now, whether or not that really changes much, because that team is pretty stacked, is hard to say, but if he can have a really good either performance with Giddey or just performance in and of himself, I think that makes him more valuable, even if he doesn't end up on the Thunder. Right? Even if he gets cut, another team might be considering to pick him up if he has a really good couple of games. And then the warm-up performance, beating Venezuela, losing just barely to Brazil, beating South Sudan, beating France. That was a big win, especially after the Brazil loss, and then beating Georgia. So you're seeing this team come together and take on some actually pretty challenging competition, especially with France there. Brazil also a fairly good team, but I don't know that I would put them up there with France by any means. So, and of course, these are warm-up games. These are not the final say of, how this goes. So you kind of take that with a grain of salt, if you will. But these are the 3 teams I'm excited for. And, outside of Germany in that poll, the U.S. and Australia, very good chances to go far in this. Canadians as well. The Germans as well. The Germans have been really tough games for everyone they've played in the warm-ups. And they've got some pretty stacked NBA players on there as well. But let me know in the comments, who are you rooting for? Who are you looking at player-wise? And who do you think can really show out in the FIBA World Cup? Thanks for sticking with me, guys. I appreciate it. I'll see you in the next one.